It's good to be with you this morning. And I know sometimes you may not know exactly what I'm doing, and I don't always want to let you kind of into the kitchen and see how the sermons are made, if you understand what I'm saying. Better to see the final meal. But it was supposed to be the first 4 weeks, but it kind of got delayed because I missed the last Sunday, so we're into February, what I'd hoped to cover in January. But what I have been wanted to do in January, creeping into February, is in the first 4 sermons of the year to lay out really a vision of what we need to be as a church. And so I've been doing that, and you may be wondering, well, how were you doing that? Because they weren't all like part 1, part 2, part 3, which I know I do a lot of, so you kind of get that. But I want you to think about what we've looked at so far in the last 4 sermons. The first was a passion for the lost. And we cannot be the kind of church that God wants us to be if we don't have that. That's our purpose. We're supposed to be a light in the darkness and a light in this world. And then the second was an adherence to the biblical message. What are we showing? What are we demonstrating? What are we inviting people to? It's to the gospel, to faith, fellowship, family, forgiveness, those things. Those are an adherence to the message. And then last week we talked about eternal vision, reminding ourselves that life is not just about what we do right now. Life is about what is coming later. We have to live with that in view. We have to live and plan a little bit for the future because what we're doing now will affect the future. And this morning is the last one that I want to look at. And I've preached on this similarly a few different times, but I'll try not to be too repetitive. The good news is I tried to find the sermon I thought I did last, and I couldn't find it, so I had to start from scratch. So I don't know if it's going to be new or not, but it should be. I want to preach on a good fit. A good fit. How many of you see that puzzle piece there? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go on too. But I want to start with something maybe that's relatable to you. How many of you have a favorite article of clothing, a favorite shirt, favorite pair of shorts, favorite jeans? They fit you just right. But I'm guessing if you're married and you're a guy, your wife won't let you wear them to church, right? Probably not. We all have that piece of clothes that fits us just right. Now, it may be tattered and not fit for public viewing, but it's just right. It's just perfect. And when we are wearing that, we just feel at home. We feel comfortable. Everything is just how we like it. It's a perfect fit, right? It's a good fit. And in that, we can be maybe the most productive we feel, or the most at home, or the most comfortable. How many of you have ever had something that was not a perfect fit? Like you put it on and you knew every moment you were wearing it, this is, I'm wearing this, but I can't wait until I can change into my perfect fit, right? Some of you are probably thinking, that's right now. Well, am I going to talk about clothes? Is that going to be our 4th sermon, our 4th emphasis today? I'm going to go through the list of clothing that is acceptable and what you should wear and what you shouldn't wear, and what brands you should buy and what brands you shouldn't buy. You think that's where I'm going with this? No, I think you're right. I'm pretty ambivalent about that stuff, truthfully. I'm not necessarily thinking of us all finding the perfect outfit. If I were, I could probably tell you a place or two that you could buy them. No, that's not what I'm looking at. But what I want us to realize, and one of the things you realize in life as you mature a little bit, and won't use the old word that was thrown around from time to time, but let's just call it maturity. As you mature a little bit, is you realize that in life you can't know and do everything. You can't be interested in everything. You're not talented in everything. How many of you ever tried something and realized that's not for me because I'm not good at it? Right. And some of life is just learning what you are terrible at and not doing it anymore. Isn't that true? I think it is. And there are abilities and desires in which that we tend to coalesce around. There are things that we tend to be very productive in life, and as we cultivate them and as we invest time and energy and thought and learning into them, we become better and better, and we truly find where we are most productive. One of the real keys in life is to find those areas, avenues, and places. Now, I'm not going to give you career advice today either. That's not really where I want us to go. But what I do want us to talk about is, as a church, finding the place that you fit. There are a lot of different roles in the church that so many of you participate in. And I am so thankful for them, because there are some things that I am really bad at, and if I didn't have you around to help, we'd all be in trouble. But what I want us to recognize is, as a church body, God has brought us all together so that we can fulfill His purpose of being a church that is effective in our community and in our world. And that requires all of us to find the place that we fit and then to function in that. And when we do, then the church runs well. And God has always talked about this as a concept for His church. The text that we're going to look at today is from 1 Corinthians. And I've said this before, but I want to just remind you of the context of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians was a church that, as far as we understand, was very big. There are some studies that suggest it was 10% of the population of Corinth. So that would have been a mega church. But they weren't operating smoothly. They were operating very poorly. And because of it, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians spends more time talking about how churches should run than in any of the other epistles put together. So in one sense, we owe a debt to this very dysfunctional church in Corinth, because it made the Apostle Paul write down a lot of things about how churches should function. And one of the most important things that he comes to is in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And indeed, it's verse 12. And so that is where we are going to begin and where we are going to read this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verses 12 to 14. So pay attention to some of the words here. Note the ones that are repeated in this passage as we read it. For as the body is one, and hath many members, and all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit are we all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond or free, and have been all made to drink into one Spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. Now, the first thing he does is he's using something that is familiar to explain a truth. How many of you have a body? Okay, some of you don't. I want to talk to you later. Or it's not working, at least the hand portion. When the Apostle Paul uses the body as his example and as his explanation, he's giving us something that everybody can understand, right? I mean, if you talk about farming, you have a certain people that could talk. If you talk about retail, you have certain people that would understand. If you talk about cooking, some people would understand. If you talk about eating, pretty much everybody understands. So there are some things that everybody understands. There are some things that are more specific. But this truth, I would suggest, is so central that the Apostle Paul is going to use a metaphor that we all understand. Because we all have a body. We don't all have the same body, but we all have a body. And so we all understand the concept that he is going to use as his central example and theme. I want to, before we go on, look at some of the words that are used. The key word, of course, first is body, which is used 5 times, if I counted correctly. 5 times he uses body. he always uses it, or for 4 out of the 5, he uses the word body and the word one. One body. Not multiple bodies, but one body. So what is he emphasizing? If I say one, you're emphasizing unity, aren't you? You're emphasizing that everyone is a part of the whole. Everyone is a part of the same. There's not many bodies, there's only one body. He also is using what in his day was what we might call inclusive language. I know that's a big loaded word in our society, but think about what he's saying there. When he says that we are not Jew or Gentile, that is the most inclusive statement he can say in his day. Because while we might separate on ethnic terms, we might say something like, it doesn't matter if you're black, white, or brown, or what shade of whatever you are. We might say something like that if we were going to try to be something somewhat inclusive. But this, where he is saying, whether we be Jew or Greek, we all have one spirit, we are all part of one body, is inclusive language of his day. He's trying to say that it doesn't matter what you look like, or what part or what your ethnicity is, where you're from, you are all a part of the body of Christ through Christ and by the Spirit. Because when we accept him, we don't experience one spirit for one kind, one spirit for another. There's one spirit, there's one body, there's one God. And so we've been brought into the family of God, and we have become one through that. But then you'll notice another word in there, and it's a different word. Instead of one, he uses the word many. And that is the word that he uses to illustrate that we are not all identical. Christians are not, nor were even the writers of the gospel, carbon clones of one another. They wrote with different styles. They wrote with different intent. They wrote with different language. One of the ways to think about some of the Gospels, if you look at the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Mark is, don't be offended by this, but this is one way to think of it, is the comic book version of the Gospel. It's the action gospel with very little dialogue, with very little stories, with almost no parables, and it's all just action, action, action. Jesus is doing so many things. That's why it's so short. It's the shortest gospel too. Only 16 verses. It's 16 chapters. Because Mark, when he wrote his gospel, was writing from a different perspective than someone like Luke. And I don't know if you've ever gotten into Luke, but not only are there more chapters, but they're much longer than Mark's chapters, and they have a lot more of a lot of different things. They weren't carbon clones when they were writing even something so important as recording the life of Christ. And God did not make us to be identical. We don't have unity through identicalness. Not sure that's a word, but we'll go with it. We have unity because we are bound by a common purpose and a common goal. And because we are a part of the body, we are united in the one body. But it's not that we lose our individuality. God has called us as individuals to embrace the way in which he has created us and recognize that what we bring to the table, because of who we are and because God working in us has given us something unique and different, that is very valuable. He goes on to explain this further, and I want to look at it in verse 15, 16, and 17. Not identical. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear shall say, because I am not the eye, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole were the hearing, where were the smelling? we all know that a foot is not a hand. Is that true? An ear is not an eye. Nor is it a nose. I don't know about you, but I've never smelled anything bad with my ears. Everything smells the same, like wax. That's a joke. All right. I'm going to get myself in trouble here. But we just happen to have the person with the most medical knowledge in our congregation with us today, and I'm sure she would tell us that ears and eyes are different, right? I'm on the right track. There we go. Thank you. All right. Now, I want you to think about what he's really saying, though. In one sense, what he's saying is we can't say, just because I'm not like this brother or sister who sits over here, therefore I'm not important to the body, therefore I'm not a part of the body. You know, there are things that happen during the service. There are people that participate during our Sunday morning service. But there are many people who participate outside of our Sunday morning service that are just as important to the role of the body as those that are more public facing. There's a lot of things that go on. Everything from preparing the bulletin to making sure our bathrooms smell reasonably good, to making sure that the building is presentable and that the lights work and that everything that in the heat works. All of the things that people do to participate. And I know a lot of you do a lot of different things in this church, and I appreciate every one of them. And I want us to recognize that what God is truly saying here is that everyone is important to the body. And while I don't necessarily take attendance, and I couldn't honestly tell some of you how many services you've missed recently or whether you've missed any at all, I will tell you this: when you're not here, you are missed. Because you are a part of the body. And when we're missing your smile, your creativity, your part, even your role, even the people that you interact with, the people that you get along best with, they all notice when you're not here. Just like we would notice if one day our pinky just quit working. You'd notice right away, right? Because what the Apostle Paul wants us to recognize is that every part of the body is important. We don't get to say, because I'm not who I think is important, therefore I don't matter, and therefore it doesn't matter whether I'm a part or not. Do you have a nice kidney? I know, it's a strange question. Some of you are like, what is he talking about? Have you ever seen your kidney? I haven't. I just picked a random thing that I was fairly safe on, I thought. Is it important? How many of you would like to have no kidneys? No hands on that one. Because they're important, right? Just because we don't always recognize or see that something matters doesn't mean it doesn't matter to the body. And that's what I want us to understand. And that's what I think is important for us to understand from what he's saying, that we are all part of the members. We are all part of what God has put together in the body, and that even though we are all different, we should recognize that we are all essential. You know, the way diversity is used today, I know some of us don't like the way it's used, right? I don't really need to go over articles and political opinions and things that you've perhaps heard. And yet, what strikes me is, like many things that we see corrupted in the world, it was really God's idea that has been misused and twisted in a way that isn't good. Okay? Because the reality is, when God created people, he created tremendous diversity, and when he gave us gifts and abilities, he created tremendous diversity. How many of you, truthfully, look around a little bit, realize that if there are certain things you would want done, you know who you'd ask in the church, and you know who you wouldn't. True? You already know my limitations. You know, if you want help with some masonry work, you won't be asking me, right? You want help with your car? Don't ask me that either. You want help even with your lawn? I'd probably show up, but you'd regret it. I know many of my limitations, and what I want you to know, and we're looking at just some of the normal abilities, and I also can tell you, you really don't want me leading worship. Because there are things that we all can do well, but we need everyone to be doing what they do well to function well. And so God has always designed his body in that way. God never designed us really to be that one-man band, that one-man show. That person who is absolutely great at everything. Now, there are a few individuals that are pretty good at that. Although I would tell you that they also are often lacking in other things. Because there are just so many things that you need in life. God's put all of those things so that we can do something really amazing. And that is this. We can need help, which teaches us humility, which teaches us to rely on someone other than ourselves, which is a really important thing, because it's hard sometimes for us to do. We like to be self-sufficient, right? We like to be masters of our own universe and not have to depend or turn to anybody. That's a really important thing for us to learn in life. But the other thing it allows us to do is it allows us to be generous and help someone else. And that's an important thing too, because it gets us outside of ourselves. It gets us outside of our needs. And where we can help others and where we can receive help, that's the kind of relation, and to use a big word, that's the kind of symbiotic relationship God has always intended for his body to be. From a pastoral perspective, what is interesting is this. In one sense, as a pastor, it's like, and not always, but much of the year, you're walking through a difficult time with someone in the church. Either you know they're going through a hard time or you're walking through it with them. So it's like there is always a crisis for someone at all times. But thankfully, not all of you at the same time. You take turns. And you're also experiencing good times in your life at different times as well. So there is that sense where there is always a deficit and there is always an abundance. And where the deficit and the abundance get together and where they meet, that's where we really see the work of God in his body. And he's cautioning us very strongly in this regard. Be and accept the role that God has given you. And don't say, it doesn't matter because I'm not who I think is important. Because everything is important. Now, how many of you have ever picked up something with your toes? You know, you were lazy, you didn't feel like bending down, you thought, oh, I can just reach that with my foot, right? I've done that, you know. But how many of you recognize that it's less efficient than using your hand? Right? I mean, truthfully, you know, if you had to pick up like 20 Legos, you can do it with your feet, but it's going to take 3 to 4 times as long. True? And sometimes that's what happens in a church when we are outside of the roles that we are designed for. Sometimes the hand decides it doesn't want to work, and so then the foot has to pick up the slack. And the foot can do it, but it's way slower and not as good. And so just think about that as you begin to ask yourself, you know, where and what has God called me to do, and how can I function? And obviously, if you're a foot, you don't want to be doing handwork, but if you're a hand, you want to make sure you're doing work, because otherwise a foot's going to be doing it, and that's not only going to smell bad, but it's also going to be less effective. Because I don't know about you. If somebody's serving me with their hands, I'm thinking they probably washed, it's good. But if they're using their foot, I'm probably that hungry. All right, let's go on to point number 2. And I think we're going to have to abbreviate some of these a little because point number 1 took us a lot longer than I planned. All right, let's go to point number 2. Now, I want you to remember something that's very important. 1 Corinthians 12:18. But now hath God set the members, every one of them, in the body, as it hath pleased him. And if they were all one member, where were the body? But now are they many members, yet but one body. And so what he's reminding us is, yes, we are all different. We are all, in one sense, special, the good kind. And God has put us in place. Now, the key thing for us to remember, too, though, is this. God has done it as it pleased him. I like to ask this question, and I've asked it before, but perhaps some of you haven't heard it. How many of you picked your body? You remember before you were born? Just before you were coming, and you said, this is what I want to look like. This is who I want to be born to. These are the parents I want. This is the talents and abilities I want, and I want all of this. How many of you picked? You remember picking that? How many of you think you might have picked something different if you'd had the choice? Right? You might want it to be able to sing without carrying it in a bucket, right? You want to carry a tune without having to use a bucket. You don't say that? Okay. But God decided. You didn't choose. And in one sense, we're told not to be proud. We're told to remind ourselves and be humble that God gave us what he gave us. He gave us the tools we have to work with. He decided because he knew what was best, and he knew where we would be, and he knew how we would have to function. And from that, we have to understand. He knew best. Don't look at someone else and say, I want to be them. I wonder if I would get any participation if I ever asked you that. If you ever thought that. You probably are ashamed to admit it. And I know you don't like raising your hands, so I won't make you. But I will admit, there have been times in my life where I've said, man, I wish I could do that. But we have to recognize the abilities that God has given us and work within them, and recognize that what he has given us is vital and essential for the situation he places us in. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't learn, that we don't grow, that maybe there are some things that we didn't ever think we could do that God can develop in us. I'm not suggesting that what you are at 20 is what you are for the rest of your life. Okay, I'm not saying that. That's a very limited set of data. But we need to recognize that God knew what he was doing when he made us. Don't be jealous and envious of others. Don't say, I wish I had that part. Work in the part that you have. And there is something from the parable of the talents where if you are faithful with what God gives you and what you know he's given you, that he will give you more. And I've seen that in life. So in the place that God has placed you, walk and work in that. And again, many and one. Many and one is the contrast in this passage. Meaning that we are all different. We have many different functions, roles, and abilities. But we are all pulling together for one purpose. We are all part of the body of Christ. Now I want to go to Romans chapter 12. And you're probably a little familiar with this because we looked at it in Sunday school last week, but I just want to remind you of it. Romans chapter 12. For as we have many members in one body, and all members have not the same office, so we, being many, are one body in Christ, and every one members of one another. Different functions, different offices, different roles, but all of them matter. They matter to a church, they matter to God, and ultimately what we are all looking for is that when we stand before God from the parable of the talents, we will hear him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You did what I called you to do. You did what I asked you to do. You lived your life for my glory and honor." And the unique thing about that is that it doesn't matter in one sense what it is. The reward is based on what God asked you to do. And so if God asks you to do something and you say, "Well, I don't want to do that. I'd rather do something else." Are you going to hear, "Well done and good and faithful servant"? I don't think so. Now again, I realize that we have to find that spot. And if you know me very well, you know one of the things I love is to ask people where they feel God calling them and help them do that. Those of you who've gone through membership recently, you know one of the questions I ask you is how do you see yourself fitting in this church? What do you see yourself being called to? Because that's what I want to find. I want to find out what God has put within you, what your vision is, what he's asking of you, what you feel drawn to, and I want to help you do that. I feel like that's my whole job. And I love it. There's nothing that makes me happier than seeing someone do something that they love to do that furthers the mission of the kingdom and of this church. That makes me excited. Doesn't take much to get me excited in some ways, I guess, but it's a really special thing. It's just, all right, I want to look one final scripture. Ephesians 4:16 this morning. Ephesians 4:16. Looks like I may have put 15, but I'm pretty sure it's 16, so we'll go with 16. All right. "From whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love." Each part is working properly. When the hand is doing hand things and the foot is doing foot things, it works out. When you're not smelling with your ear or trying to hear with your eye, it works out. When each part is working properly. That's important. And it's about finding that good and perfect fit. Now, do you remember, and you could see on the background, we're using a puzzle. And that made me think about something that I had very limited participation in. My wife was much more enthusiastic about. We attempted, and we didn't get very far, mainly because of me being the anchor, but I want to talk about my deficiencies. We attempted to put a puzzle together kind of over Christmas. It turned out to be a very difficult puzzle. You would put it together, it would look like it fit, you'd put a bunch of things around, and then you'd be like, no, this can't be right. So then you'd have to rip a whole section out and start over. And that was more than I could bear. Because it wasn't a perfect fit. You'd get a piece in and it looked like it was almost a good fit, but it wasn't quite right. And what I believe we want to strive for in life is asking God, where is my fit? Where do I fit in the church that you have brought me to? And how can I best function and be a part that is working properly? Because when we do, and when we are, the mission goes forward so much better. And God can do much greater things with us as a church when we are in the roles we should be. when we are doing what we should be. As I was preparing this message, I was thinking about how the different parts of my body were helping me prepare. Those of you who visit me from time to time know that I usually have music playing in my office, right? If you've come to see me, right? Almost always have music. That's because so my ears are listening to music. If my wife were there, she would tell you that my mouth is humming off key to that same music. She doesn't really like being around me when I study because I tend to hum to whatever I'm listening to, and then my fingers are typing and hopefully my mind is thinking. So there were 4 parts of my body that were going into preparing this sermon. And truthfully, my foot was probably tapping too. I get in trouble for that one too sometimes. But so my whole body was participating, but it wasn't doing the same things. My mouth was not listening to the music, it was humming. My fingers were not tapping the floor, they were tapping the keys. My ears were listening to the music. So even in the natural body, there's a whole bunch of different parts of me that help to write what we just talked about today. In a church, each one of you is important. You each bring something unique to this body of believers. Perspective, ways of thinking, experience, lack of experience. That's even valuable too sometimes. Because you sometimes don't know what we can't do. So you have faith to do what we need to. There are so many things that God has placed in us and that He brings through us. And so we want to recognize the importance that we want to be a part of the body joined together, functioning as God has called us to. And that if we will do that, we will be the kind of body of believers that pleases God, ultimately. And so that is my goal. I'm hoping that none of you are sitting there thinking, well, I shouldn't be doing the things I am in the church because I'm not any good at it. So hopefully tomorrow I don't get a bunch of calls if I quit, because I don't feel the witness on any of that, guys. But what I want you to recognize is that while it may not be visible what is done, while everyone may not always even know. And I thought of a great example. I don't even know who bought the big bag of candy we've been enjoying for the last month or so. I think I know who stocks it. But I can tell you that the kids enjoy it, and the big kids like me, they all enjoy it, right? And that's just a little thing that's done in the church. But is our church better when we have candy on Sunday morning? I don't know. But you were all smiling, so maybe. What I want you to think of is even just small little things can make a difference in our lives. And so we want to appreciate those who, like I said, I don't even know who bought the candy. But thank you anyway. If you're here, thank you. All right? Little things like that. And so what I want us to think is that we always sometimes, or we can sometimes just think of big things, and what we don't recognize is sometimes just being there to have a conversation, a smile, a handshake, or say, how are you doing today, can be a valuable part of being the body of Christ. So I want us to recognize the role that God has for each one of us and to embrace that. Let's have a word of prayer before Jeff and the ladies come, and we'll sing a closing song.